Hi, Chuck. How are you? It's so nice being here tonight. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and I'm excited. I'm excited because today we're unpacking the godfather of the unconscious himself, Sigmund Freud, the man who convinced the world that your weird dreams, mommy issues, and that one time you dropped your ice cream at the age of 4 are all connected. Buckle up because this episode is going to be intensely revealing. Let's start with the headlines. Sigmund Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in Moravia, now Czech Republic, in the Austrian Empire. He trained as a neurologist but became the undisputed father of psychoanalysis. That magical process where you lay on the couch, free associate, and pay a very expensive listener to hear you dig up your childhood trauma. Now, the origin story. Little Ziggy was the golden child, firstborn son of Jacob Freud, a wool merchant who'd already been married twice, and his much younger third wife, Amalia. Mom absolutely worshipped him. She called him her golden Ziggy and let him sleep in parental bedroom way longer than any parental manual would approve. Freud later joked that this family arrangement probably inspired his entire theory of the Oedipus complex. Little boys wanting to eliminate daddy and possess mommy. When your mother treats you like the Messiah and your father is old enough to be your grandfather, you start noticing patterns. The family moved to Vienna when Sigmund was 4. Vienna at that time was this glittering, anxious, intellectually caffeinated city, the perfect petri dish for a future genius of neurosis. Young Freud was brilliant, top of the class, reading Shakespeare at 8, graduating summa cum laude. He originally wanted to study law but fell in love with science. He spent years in physiology lab, famously hunting for the testicles of eels. Yes, really. Freud was an eel gonad expert before he became a mind expert. Then came the turning point, Paris, 1885. He studied under the showman neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, who was hypnotizing patients with hysteria. People paralyzed or blind for purely psychological reasons. And that's when Freud's mind exploded. The body could break because the mind was broken. Back in Vienna, he teamed up with Joseph Breuer, and in 1900 he published The Interpretation of Dreams, arguing that dreams are wish fulfillments and the gateways to the unconscious. Here is the surprising part. The Interpretations of Dreams, Freud's most famous book, was not a bestseller. In fact, the first edition sold only 351 copies in the first 6 years. By today's standard, that would be considered a publishing disaster. So how did an obscure Viennese neurologist with a book no one was buying could become one of the most influential thinkers of modern history? Part of the answer is that Freud wasn't just selling a book. He was selling a radically new way of looking at human beings. He claimed that beneath our conscious thoughts lies an entire hidden world of desires, fears, memories, and conflicts that shape our behavior without us even realizing it. That was a shocking idea. Freud suggested that dreams have meanings, that childhood experiences have lasting psychological scars, and that people are often driven by the motives they don't understand. Whether people found this idea brilliant or outrageous, they couldn't stop talking about them. Freud was also remarkably good at building a movement. He gathered a circle of devoted followers, trained new analysis, and encouraged them to spread psychoanalysis across Europe and America. Freud's ideas spread like wildfire in the early 20th century. Intellectuals, artists, writers flocked to him. The surrealists worshipped him. Hollywood found him fascinating. His lectures drew crowds. Psychoanalysis became fashionable among the wealthy and the artistic. It was understandable the Victorian era was cracking. World War I showed humanity's dark side. And people were ready for a theory that explained our irrational behavior. And Freud offered secular, scientific-sounding way to talk about sex, guilt, anxiety, and family dysfunctions, topics polite society had repressed. By the 1920s, he was a celebrity intellectual. He toured, gave interviews, influenced everything from literature to advertising. His beard, intense gaze, and cigars became iconic. He wasn't afraid of controversy. He used cocaine enthusiastically, both personally and medically in his early years, writing love letters to the drug before its dangers became clear. He had intense friendships and dramatic breakups, most famously with Carl Jung, his chosen successor, who eventually rejected Freud's heavy emphasis on sex. It's important to understand that Carl Jung played a crucial early role in helping Freud move from a controversial Viennese theory builder into an internationally recognized intellectual figure. When the first two met in 1907, Jung was a rising star in psychiatry. Young, highly educated, respected within academic medicine, while Freud was still largely viewed as an outsider with provocative and, to many, unsettling ideas about sexuality and the unconscious. But Jung's faith in the theory of psychoanalysis gave Freud something he badly needed: legitimacy beyond his own circle in Vienna. Freud even referred to him as his crown prince, hoping Jung would help carry the movement into mainstream science and ensure its future beyond Freud's own generation. Together they collaborated closely, exchanged extensive correspondence, and in 1909 traveled to the United States to lecture at Clark University, a landmark moment that introduced psychoanalysis to American academic audiences. In a very real sense, Jung functioned as both ambassador and amplifier, helping Freud's ideas cross linguistic, cultural, institutional borders. Ironically, their later split would become just as influential as their partnership. But in those early years, Jung was one of the key reasons Freud stopped being a marginal figure and started becoming a global one. So, how did it all start? Ironically, it all started with a patient Freud never actually treated. In the 1880s, a young woman known as Anna O suffered from a baffling collection of symptoms: paralysis, speech difficulties, hallucinations, and other physical problems that doctors couldn't explain. She was treated by Freud's colleague, physician Joseph Breuer. So during treatment, Breuer noticed that when Anna talked about painful memories and emotions, some of her symptoms improved. So she famously called this process the talking cure. And Freud was fascinated. Together, Freud and Breuer published studies on hysteria in 1895, arguing that psychological distress can manifest in physical symptoms. The book attracted attention because it challenged the prevailing medical view that unexplained illnesses were purely biological. Freud would later take this idea much further and much more controversially. Soon Freud became less interested in the symptoms themselves and more interested in the hidden forces he believed were driving them. So his central idea was revolutionary for the time. Most of the mind operates outside conscious awareness. In other words, we are not the rational captains of our own ship. Much of our behavior is influenced by desires, fears, memories, and conflicts lurking beneath the surface. Freud called this hidden realm the unconscious. To explain how the mind works, Freud proposed three interacting parts. The id, the impulsive part that wants immediate pleasure, like think, I want it now. Then the superego, the internal moral judge, that voice that says you absolutely shouldn't do it. And then the ego, the negotiator stuck in the middle, trying to keep both sides happy while dealing with reality. Freud also believed that people protect themselves from uncomfortable truths through defensive mechanisms. For example, like denial, refusing to accept reality, or projection, attributing your own feelings to someone else. Repression, pushing disturbing memories out of awareness. So if you ever accuse someone of being angry when you were the angry one, Freud would have smiled knowingly. Another of Freud's famous theories concerned dreams. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious, believing they revealed hidden wishes and unresolved conflicts. According to Freud, a dream wasn't just a dream. It was a coded message from the deepest part of the mind. And then came the theory that made him both famous and infamous, psychosexual development. Freud stated that childhood experience shape adult personality and that psychological conflicts at different stage of development leave lasting marks. Modern psychology rejects much of this theory, but Freud's emphasis on childhood experiences profoundly influenced later thinkers and the development and the progress in psychology. Not all of Freud's ideas survive scientific scrutiny. Many psychologists criticize his theories for being difficult or even impossible to test. Some concepts rely heavily on interpretation rather than the actual evidence. Yet, even many critics acknowledge his enormous influence, because it's undeniable. Even though not all of his theories were proven or some were rejected, still the impact he made on psychology is huge. Because before Freud, people largely viewed mental illness as a medical or even a moral problem. After Freud, the idea that talking about thoughts, memories, emotions, and childhood experiences could help heal psychological suffering became a part of mainstream culture. Because now it's everywhere, right? Who's your therapist? So while modern psychology has moved beyond many of Freud's specific claims, his biggest contribution may have been changing the questions we ask about the human mind. Not bad for a man who became famous partly because of a patient he never treated. One of Freud's most famous and most controversial ideas is the Oedipus complex, a theory he built directly from the ancient Greek tragedy of Oedipus Rex, a story that already feels like it was written to make philosophers uncomfortable. In the myth, Oedipus is told a prophecy that he will kill his father and marry his mother. Naturally, he does what any reasonable tragic hero would do. He tries very hard not to. He leaves home. He changes his life, avoids his supposed parents. And in classic mythological irony, every step he takes to escape fate is exactly what drives him towards it. On the road, he kills a stranger in a dispute. Later, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, saves the city, and is rewarded with marriage to a widowed queen. Only later does the story tighten its grip. The stranger was his father, the queen is his mother, and the happy ending collapses into catastrophe, guilt, and self-inflicted blindness. That's what I find especially interesting. Self-inflicted blindness. So a totally healthy body can become sick from the mind. Greek tragedy, in other words, doesn't believe in subtlety. Freud looked at this story and did what Freud often did. He asked, what if this is not just mythology, but psychology wearing a costume? His proposal was the Oedipus complex. In his view, early childhood is not emotionally simple or innocent in the way Victorian society liked to imagine. Instead, he argued that young children experience unconscious emotional currents, intense attachment to the mother paired with rivalry or tension towards the father. Not as conscious desire in the adult sense, but as a tangled psychological drama playing out beneath the awareness. The father figure in this framework becomes both obstacle and model, someone the child resents, fears, and simultaneously imitates. Freud believed this internal conflict had to be resolved for personality to stabilize. The resolution in his theory comes through identification, where the child gradually adopts the values and authority of the parents they once saw as a rival. In other words, Freud wasn't saying everyone secretly wants their mother in a literal or theatrical sense. He was trying to map a much stranger claim that family relationships in early life leave psychological echoes so deep that they later reappear disguised as preference, anxiety, ambition, guilt. But fame and the intellectual prestige could not protect Freud from the horrors of his era. As a Jewish intellectual in Vienna, he watched the rise of Nazism with growing alarm. In 1933, Nazi authorities publicly burned his books in Berlin as part of a campaign against the un-German spirit. Freud famously remarked, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they're content with burning my books." The danger became immediate in 1938, after Nazi Germany seized Austria. Freud's home was searched by the Gestapo. His finances were restricted, and his daughter Anna was briefly detained and interrogated. Realizing that Vienna was no longer safe, Freud agreed to leave. By then, Freud was already seriously ill. For more than 16 years, he had suffered from cancer of the jaw and mouth, likely linked to his lifelong cigar habit. The disease led to a dozen of medical procedures and constant pain, yet he continued to write and receive visitors almost until the end. In September 1939, as Europe entered World War II, Freud's condition became unbearable. Remembering a promise not to prolong his suffering, his physician, Dr. Max Schwach, administered morphine to ease his pain. So Freud died in London on September 23rd, 1939, at the age of 83. His death is often regarded as one of the earliest well-known cases of physician-assisted dying, carried out according to his own wishes. But the legacy he left. While Freud's ideas quietly infiltrated hundreds of films like a well-timed Freudian sleep, only a handful of movies have been brave enough to put the bearded doctor himself, or his revolutionary theories front and center. Let's talk about the famous ones. First up is Freud, 1962, also known as Freud, the Secret Passion. It was directed by the legendary John Huston and starring Montgomery Clift as a young, brooding Sigmund. This one zooms in on his early wild years, the cocaine-fueled experiments, the hysterical patients, his rocky partnership with Breuer, and the birth of psychoanalysis. It's intense, a touch melodramatic, and features a screenplay that Jean-Paul Sartre originally worked on before he stormed off, naturally. Cliff looks like he's carrying the weight of the entire unconscious on his shoulders. Very method, very tortured genius. Then there was A Dangerous Method in 2011. David Cronenberg's deliciously intellectual drama. Viggo Mortensen serves up a perfectly stern, cigar-chomping Freud, opposite Michael Fassbender as a rebellious Carl Jung. Throw in Keira Knightley as a brilliant and troubled patient Sabina, and you got a steamy cocktail of power struggles, daddy issues, and theatrical smackdowns. It's basically the origin story of psychoanalysis with extra sex and betrayal. pure Freudian catnip. And more recently, Freud's Last Session in 2023 gives us a fictional but fascinating final showdown. Anthony Hopkins plays an elderly, cancer-ridden Freud in 1939 London, verbally sparring with a young C.S. Lewis, played by Matthew Good, about God, war, sex, and the meaning of life, while the bombs of World War II, ramble outside. It's intimate, witty, and surprisingly moving. Watching Freud's face his own mortality with that trademark mix of brilliance and stubbornness. I have my personal favorite movie about Freud, and it's a Spanish movie, Spanish comedy called Inconscientes of 2004, also known as The Unconscious. Set in 1913 Barcelona, it follows a very pregnant, fiercely modern woman whose famous Freudian psychiatrist husband suddenly disappears. With the help of her brother-in-law, she drives into a witty, mystery-filled investigation laced with sexual taboos, early psychoanalysis, and plenty of hilarious jabs at the new talking cure. It's lighthearted, clever, and perfectly captures the excitement and absurdity of Freud's ideas spreading through sophisticated European society. Think Sherlock Holmes meet Freudian force with gorgeous architecture in the background. And speaking of the ripple effects, once Freud cracked open the Pandora's box of the unconscious, the entire art world lost its collective mind in the best possible way. His radical notions of repressed desires, hidden traumas, and dreams as the royal road to the truth became pure creative rocket fuel. The surrealist movement practically worshipped him. Salvador Dali melted clocks in the persistence of memory as if time itself had slipped into the subconscious. René Magritte, Belgian artist, played delicious mind games with floating apples and bowler hats that screamed, "This is not what you think." Oh, Max Ernst, German artist, created eerie, dreamlike collages that felt pulled straight from a patient's nightmare. In literature, James Joyce turned Ulysses into a sprawling stream of consciousness odyssey. Virginia Woolf dove deep into inner thoughts in Miss Dalloway, and Franz Kafka turned bureaucratic anxiety into surreal masterpieces like The Metamorphosis, all dripping with Freudian undernotes. Even theater and painting got the bug, with artists treating canvases and stages like psychoanalytic couches, where the irrational, sexual, and absurd could run wild. Freud didn't just analyze the mind, he accidentally became the patron saint of modern weird art, proving that sometimes the best creative fuel is whatever your id is whispering when ego isn't listening. So why does Freud still matter? Not because every one of his theories was correct, many were not. Modern psychology had challenged, revised, and outright rejected large parts of his work. The Oedipus complex is controversial, his ideas about women have been heavily criticized, and yet, more than 80 years after his death, we're still talking about him. Why? Because Freud changed the questions we asked about ourselves. Before Freud, many people thought of the mind as something largely rational and transparent. Freud shattered that comforting illusion. He proposed that beneath our conscious thoughts lies an entire hidden world of fears, desires, memories, conflicts, motivations that quietly shape our lives without our awareness. Whether he was right in every detail is almost beside the point. His revolutionary insight was that we are strangers to ourselves. He taught us to pay attention to dreams, slips of the tongue, as the famous Freudian sleep, recurring patterns, childhood experiences, and the stories we tell about our lives. He suggested that the things we try hardest to ignore often have the greatest influence over us. Love, jealousy, guilt, ambition, shame, sexuality, grief. Freud dragged these subjects out of the shadows, placed them at the center of human psychology. His influence spread far beyond therapy. Literature, film, art, philosophy, advertising, popular culture all absorbed Freudian ideas. Even people who have never opened one of his books casually use concepts he helped popularize: repression, denial, defense mechanism, unconscious motives. all these cool words, right? Modern psychotherapy in all its many forms still exists partly because Freud convinced the world that talking about our inner lives could be healing. Of course, Freud was far from perfect. He could be stubborn, dogmatic, and fiercely resistant to criticism. Some of his theories now seem misguided or even bizarre. But intellectual history rarely remembers people for being perfectly correct. It remembers those who changed the conversation. And few people changed the conversation more than Sigmund Freud. He ventured into one of the last great unexplored frontiers, the human mind, and he attempted to draw a map. The map was incomplete, some parts were wrong, a few sections may have been pure imagination, but countless thinkers, therapists, writers, scientists have spent the last century exploring territory that Freud was among the first to chart. So the next time you have a strange dream, accidentally say exactly what you didn't mean to say, find yourself repeating the same relationship pattern, or wonder why human beings can be so irrational despite their best intentions, remember the bearded Viennese doctor who dared to suggest that there is much more going on inside our heads than we realized. You may not agree with Sigmund Freud, but you're almost certainly living in the world he helped to create. I hope you enjoyed it, Chai. Thank you guys for watching. Sorry, I think I pushed the wrong button in the end, but you'll forgive me, alright?